Well, first, actually, I wanted to tell you something following something. Before we start kind of the second half, what I was supposed to do is kind of transition from Abuna's talk. You know how he gave us, how amazing was it, by the way? Remember how we were talking about? It was really great. So he was kind of giving us the teaching, like the core, and then George asked me to kind of transition from that into some applicable, I mean, it was applicable to begin with, but talking about specific issues that we'll get into. So later on, hopefully if the docs come, also they'll share some things about abortion, end-of-life care, and euthanasia. Those are some things on the agenda for us. So that's kind of the second half of the day. The first half is the core foundational teaching, and then the second half will be some of this stuff. But before that, I mentioned downstairs the Pope thing. I wanted to give you like an update about that real quick. So on Sunday, this past Sunday, we had a CMANA meeting with the Pope, which was really great because it was the first time we got to sit with him for like an hour to tell him in detail like what CMANA is, where CMANA's been, what the plans are in the future, all that kind of stuff. So I want at least to share that with you here so that you know that like we're not like some side group. It's like legit, right? So the Pope was really excited also. He was really happy about like what's been happening over the past couple of years. We showed him all the missions. I think there was 10 people represented there, and I was there like kind of on your behalf for like the students and the residents. And they told him about Bolivia, Ghana, Egypt, Ethiopia, all that stuff, and also the domestic stuff. And Dr. Ayman was the one like the designated spokesman, and he was giving like a lot of credit to the student chapter. He was saying like the students have been super active, have been doing so many things, and kind of like really bigging it up. And the Pope, kind of as a response, said, you know what, I want to sit with you guys for even longer. So the team that's going in November, he invited them to sit for a longer amount of time, because it was like an hour, even though an hour is a lot of time for the Pope's time. But he said, I want to sit with you more and get to know you about you even more, so I can give like a formal endorsement after having studied the information more. So that's great news. I wanted to kind of start off with for our CMANA group. Cool. With that in mind, we'll jump into today's conversation. As you see here, so our topic for the day has been sanctity of life, and what we want to talk about for a little bit now is this issue of, like I said, we're going to be talking later about abortion, end-of-life care, and euthanasia. These practical issues of end-of-life care or end of sanctity of life. And so I'll jump into it this way. Have you guys seen this picture before? There's a little, I don't know if you can read the text, but there's a joke on it that says like there's someone that went to the doctor and said, doctor, I'm really depressed, you know? It says it as kind of a joke. It says I'm really depressed, and he says, you know, life is hard and things are getting really difficult, whatever. And the doctor says, don't worry, there's this amazing world-class clown that's going to come and kind of fix it all. And his name is, I don't know how to pronounce it, right? It was Pagliacci or something like that? The famous clown, Pagliacci. So he says, don't worry, he'll come and he'll make it all better. But then the guy breaks down and says, doctor, but I am that guy. I am Pagliacci, right? So the reason why it goes along with this picture is because one core like sanctity of life issue that we've had to kind of face recently with the suicide of Robin Williams for us in the church is mental health in general and suicide. Like actually just a couple days ago, someone called me, a young person in the church who had tried to take his own life. Just someone you wouldn't expect, like serving in the church, active in the church, loves God, everything's gravy, everything's fantastic. And actually even where Abuna's from, where Abuna and Gail's from, they had a tragedy in their community where a young Coptic person committed suicide. You might be familiar with it. So sometimes we can think about this, say, oh, Robin Williams, far away, suicide, whatever. And I remember one of the reactions that when we started talking about mental health a little bit more in like the church, in the Coptic church, one servant was like, you know, thank God that we're Coptic. I was like, yes, thank God we're Coptic. Thank God we take communion. I said, yes, thank God we take communion. Because we don't have to deal with this stuff. I was like, really? Okay. It's kind of like, you know, when Abuna was talking about downstairs about how we can disintegrate or we can misunderstand the Eucharist and our own faith when we kind of have some kind of bizarre expectation of it. Like communion doesn't even substitute, like we had communion, but we're still going to have pizza later. Like if you had communion earlier, right? It doesn't even substitute physical body and blood. What physical body? Hopefully not. Physical sustenance is what I'm saying, right? Sometimes I don't know why we would think it was just like it would replace medicine or would replace, but I know we don't. So the point of what I'm going to share with you is not because I think you don't know this stuff, but it's going to be because, just like we were saying downstairs, how we have a responsibility to share this with others, whether we're going to make literature or whatever it is, We want to be informed. We want to know what people are thinking in the church and how do we correct that thinking. Even on a student level or a professional level, what's my role to at least, like I just posted a status right now, for example. I'm not an OB-GYN guy, but I really believed what Abuna said about abortion was important and nobody knows about it. So I kind of feel like we should be talking about it, even though I'm not OB. You see what I'm saying? So don't feel like, and I talk about this in later slide too, but just as a beginning, don't feel like, well, I'm not a psychiatrist, you don't have to be. Or I'm not even in practice, you don't have to be. Or I'm not even whatever. The fact that we're in healthcare means the church is looking already to us for answers. The same way that you get that cousin telling you, hey, I have a, right? What are you asking me for? I'm like a second year or third year, whatever, right? But the same way you have that, like embrace that role, kind of, is what I'm telling you. Cool? So with that, I wanted to ask you this. Why do you think, why is the church's role in mental health like absolutely critical? That's going to be the first question we want to ask here. And maybe consider a couple of these things. Is A, where do you think people go to first when they're facing a mental illness? Do they call like their local lawyer? Do they call like their engineer? Even where do you think people go first, the doctor or the priest? The priest, the doctor or the church? It would go to the church first. Someone else called me recently, and thankfully, like when they spoke to someone in the church, like at least for us in New York, New Jersey now, we have an outlet of being able to say, we have no idea, okay, go to the clinic, go to the St. Luke's clinic. Hey man, right? But if we don't have that outlet, and people come to the church, and then if we have nowhere for them to go, what's going to be, you know what I'm saying? So it's critical for us as the church to be ready for this and to be preparing people for it as well. The second one is, I don't know if, I've never really calculated, but I just heard this recently when I was preparing for this talk, is Christ spent a third of his time, of his ministry in healthcare. Because healthcare, like physical healthcare, obviously 100% of his time was the healing of mankind in every possible way. But a third of it was even healthcare specifically. And lastly, what I think is even more important is historically how the church has been involved in the care of the marginalized, right? When there was like the bubonic plague and people were like leaving cities left and right, the only fools that were moving into the cities were Christians. Those are the only crazy people going into the disease. Like an example would be today, there's another kind of plague. There's the Ebola in Africa. The only people that are flying there from our people, like George, like George Hadros, our superhero, like flying to Ebola, not flying to escape Ebola, are Christians. Because we try, that's our idea, is to not be fleeing from danger, but to try to go towards the marginalized. Especially when Christ like healed the lepers, there's kind of a leprosy of the age, kind of. Whether it's HIV, if you're talking about infectious diseases, or if you talk about mental health, it's a kind of leprosy of the age. Does that kind of make sense? So that's, before we get to the what we're going to do, and those parts are easy, but thinking about why our role is really, really critical. It's good for us to have that like settled in our hearts, that like, if we don't do this, if we don't have a strong stance in the church for people who are marginalized, no one else will. We can't really wait for anyone else to be doing it. Make sense? Okay. We're going to talk about exactly what's my role. I want to talk about the role both locally, like within my church, within my parish, the role in my community, and my role globally. The globally thing, I don't know if you've ever thought about mental health like in the global scope, and I'll talk about this in a second also, but we've even sent like CMANA teams where there was a team of psychiatrists. Like one of the early trips I went on in 2009 with a team to Egypt, there were 4 psychiatrists. And I was the medical student, so I just went with the psych people. And they're like, oh, what are you really going to do in mental health in Egypt? I'm sure it's all taken care of. We did some care in monasteries where even monks need mental health care. Go figure. And that's another actually like nice misconception to have. Like when I was speaking with one of the servants who was telling me like eloquently how people who are Christian never have mental health issues, I said, but we even treated monks who dealt with different issues. They're like, well, they must be in the monastery by mistake. I said, well, if you say so. But I don't think their abbot would agree. So that was kind of an interesting thing as well. No, no, no.
But I think a thought that came to my head as well is at what point, kind of like when you're talking about the monks, but there has to be a point where a priest is sitting there listening to someone who has all these issues and can say to himself, okay, at this point he needs more help than what I can provide.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you're going to cover that or not, but that's definitely like a burning question I'd like to understand as well.
Definitely. So I know I'll give you kind of like the two experiences. One experience, thankfully, in the Northeast, Emma David, even when he was general bishop, he sat all the priests down and said, listen, you need just basic triage training so that you can know when a confession comes to you, this is not a confession, this is the beginning of a mental health issue. And that's been remarkable because that kind of prepared them to be able to refer their sons and daughters of confession to our mental health clinic. That's amazing. That happens in New York, New Jersey. What about the rest of the world? Kind of like we were saying downstairs with Abuna, we need to be able to help our parish priest also say, okay, Abuna, like you are the expert in all things spiritual. I'm not an expert, but I know a couple of things about, medicine, a little bit. I'm a medical student. I know some things. So can I share with, and both for the priest and for the servants, because we also had this conversation recently in our church of we need to have like crisis management for servants. Like when servants, because they're kind of like second line, after they call Abuna, they'll call a servant. Oh, whatever crazy crisis happens, they'll come to the servant. And sometimes the servant is not equipped to handle that crisis. So the short answer there is that we need to be able to see what we can help the priest with, say, hey Abuna, look out for these things. Can I share with you a couple of things maybe? Or if someone more senior in your church can share with you a couple, because that's what they did to the priests in New Jersey. They said to them, here are some things to be on the lookout for so that you can refer this. And the same for servants. And we'll talk about that in a second about like what my role would be locally, practically, right? And then part of that, like we're saying here, is the referral network. But you bring definitely a good point of here of the priest, just like whatever specialty you're going to practice in medicine, no one does all of medicine, right? There are specialists for a reason. So it's a matter of knowing what am I supposed to be able to treat? What am I supposed to be able to refer? And there's no doctor that feels like incompetent because they have to refer. Sometimes for us in the church, we feel like it's like all-inclusive care. Like someone can come in to the priest and the priest should be taking off, they should tell them where to move, they should but like, I think we're moving away from that as a community. Cool? So that's like the outline of my role that we're going to talk about. Here's a little doozy, like newsflash for, we understand this, but not everyone in the church believes it. Like in the Coptic church, the fact that mental illness exists, the fact that it's gravely misunderstood, and it's being overlooked and ignored, and the fact, like we were just talking about this yesterday, and for some reason, one of the encouraging things that made me feel like we need to have this conversation in this seminar is every time I've brought up the idea of mental health, like in a sitting of any kind, just when we're hanging out with people or whatever, people have really been interested in and really felt like this has been kind of like a long time coming. Like we haven't been talking about this for far too long. The HBD story I reference here is when we were beginning the clinic in New Jersey, and he sat down the staff, like both the volunteer staff and the psychiatrists, and he said sometimes the servants in the church, because they're not well informed, let's say, of the background of mental health, we're not only not helping, but we're oftentimes hurting. Like someone that was just last night was telling me this, who has chronic anxiety, like is a real diagnosed anxiety. And when they approach someone in the church about it, they say, the problem is that you don't trust God, And all we're doing there is just adding like extra guilt on the person. And not only do you have this illness, but you also like are not spiritual. You need to be repenting for your illness. It's a tough thing to be, like imagine if you had diabetes or whatever, your pancreas is no longer working. And it's like, why your pancreas isn't working? Because you just don't love God enough, That would be awful. That would be on top of you dealing with whatever you got to deal with on a daily basis. You're dealing with some spiritual consequence that isn't your fault. So it's important for us to be aware of that. I wanted to address this, and before I show you the next slide, there have been some studies on this, just so we know kind of where the landscape is for the country and the church in general. If I was to ask you, if there was a survey done, a study done across the nation of people that said, with just prayer and Bible study, you can cure schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and general mental illness. what percentage, shout out percentage for me for like the non-Christian percentage of the country and the Christians, if you want to guess. Like what percentage of the church would say, yes, you can cure mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, all that kind of stuff with prayer and Bible study? Any guesses? It's not going to be pretty. 50 is a really good guess. So this was done by Lifeway Research. And the statement here, if you see in the red, is like among all Americans in general. The blue are Americans who are Christians. Like this was done, of course, like among evangelicals. And I don't know if I would say that within the Coptic Church it would be worse, but let's just assume it would be the same. Let's assume it wouldn't be any worse. Let's assume it would be the same. So you have, see that percentage there of the blue of people who agree? 48% of people in the church would say, with just prayer and Bible study, you can overcome mental illness. That's like alarming, right? Alarming because prayer and Bible study have a huge, huge role, but we know from our background in medicine that they won't be sufficient. And the reason why it's important for us to understand that is it's important for us to understand what people within the church are thinking so that how we can try to educate, right? How we can try to share some new knowledge on that level. And then the other thing I want to share with you there is as well, for someone who has mental illness, who's struggling with that, they were surveyed to ask if they would feel comfortable attending church, if they would feel comfortable, like the church would embrace them. And 55% of the people that were asked said they would never attend worship services. So this is all in the context of within the church. We're not even talking about the community right now. And from what we've seen with the clinic in New Jersey, I keep referring to, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? We started a Coptic church mental health center that's free. And what we've seen is that it's an explosion of untreated mental illness within the church. Running across the gambit, like we have a PowerPoint presentation that we show to the priests on the update of where that's been. Every possible area of mental illness you can think of, from addiction to mood disorders to psychotic disorders. And these are not people that you just would never hear about. These are servants. These are people who are family members of people that are involved in the church. This is not like just the outlier, one random person you never see at church. So it's a part of our community. And the less we know about it, the less we can do about it. You know what I'm saying? And this stat was really important for me because this shows like how vulnerable someone is who's dealing with mental illness, who is Coptic, who is dealing with this in the church, and feels like they would never be able to attend. And the last one, kind of going back to the first slide, was this idea about suicide prevention. Because like I mentioned to you in the beginning, we've had these couple of suicide cases in the church. And in this survey, I at least want to point you to the fact of the 64% of Christians who said that we need to be doing more to prevent suicide, at least within the church, but in general also. Does that kind of make sense in terms of the stats? Like kind of painting the landscape a little bit, like showing that we have a little bit of work to do in this area. I wanted to share with you a little bit of the prevention element, the things that we can be doing in terms of like, we know the warning signs. Like for us, they're intuitive. They're things that we already know. It's a matter of, can we share these things with servants or priests in the church to say, hey, look out for when someone kind of has this like hopeless, helpless talk, or when someone like says, that just drops things like, I just want to kill myself, or whatever it is they're saying. Like sometimes we don't take things seriously because we figure it's never going to happen. It's not going to, like what are the odds of that happening in the church? It won't happen. For us to take every single one of those things really seriously. And then a nice resource here that I wanted to point you as well is that 800 number, that 800-273-TALK. It's not just like because realistically, like if I want to commit suicide right now, I'm like, you know what, let me just call, just see what they think about that. It could be really useful for us if we're not sure how to approach this. What's the local resource in LA? I don't know. What's the local resource in Staten Island? I don't know. But if I call, they would actually be able to walk you through that and say, you know what, right near you, there's this free center, there's a clinic, whatever, because that's one of our problems at this juncture. At least within the CMANA medical community, we acknowledge the problem, we understand we got to do something, but we're not sure exactly what. That's part of the reason why we have this talk, is we want to be able to have the conversation, and we want to be able to begin to have some resources about it. Cool? Here's some of the, continuing with the myths. Those are general myths that we talked about before. You see the second bullet point here? You guys know who Abuna Makariunen is? So this kind of freaked me out, by the way. So he's the priest that does like exorcisms and stuff. So this morning I woke up and he had like some fan page of his wrote something on my Facebook page. I was like, maybe I should take it away from the slide because, you know, that stuff is creepy. But this is a real issue though. Someone just recently, and again, the only reason people are talking, I'm sharing with you things that people call me is because A, from the clinic, from being involved in the clinic staff, or B, as you know, like when I started writing a little bit, just a little nothing, blurb, blogs, people are like, oh my God, finally someone's talking about it. Hey, do you know anything about this? So one of the people that randomly called me from some random state in the country said, hey, you know, my kid, my daughter got diagnosed with schizophrenia, and what's the first thing that I did as a righteous, good Coptic person? She took her to Abuna Makariunen. So, and this is not someone who's doing this out of like malice or out of even, she just didn't know. She was a really great lady, really nice. And she was like, yeah, but it didn't work. I was like, because I understand why it didn't work. Because it's not necessarily a demon. There's a thing. She's like, well, now I know. Now I understand. I said, okay, that's great. But that's like an expected kind of reaction. Like in Egypt, when we had the medical team, that CMANA trip in 2009, that was rampant. That was like anyone that has any sign of like schizophrenia, like the cancer of mental illness, they are, you know, demonic, really, until proven otherwise. Or they're just really treated poorly. And we'll talk about the third world mental health in a second, but this is within our community, right? Or like the spiritual problem element I've seen is, again, Emma David telling us this, so I wouldn't want to say this about how people handle it, but he was telling us, he was like, even sometimes fathers who are well-meaning, someone can be dealing with like major depressive disorder and could be at risk for suicide, and the father could say to him, you know, you just got to read Philippians more, you know, which is great advice. Philippians is a fantastic epistle about the joy of Christ, but it's not going to really solve the problem by itself, right? And we talk about, you guys are familiar with this, but when we share this teaching with people in the church, we want to be able to show how, for us as Christians, as Orthodox Christians in particular, we believe that God created a whole person. We believe that there is a body, there's a physical body, a biological component, and that includes medicine, and there is the spiritual component, and there is the mind as well. So that's why you would need, especially for mental health, therapy, medicine, spiritual community. All three. And like research has already shown the efficacy of both like medicine plus therapy. We're trying to do, people I'm involved with, like trying to show the efficacy of medicine, therapy, and spiritual community really being at the core of spiritual healing or mental health healing. So that's an important thing to show. So I point out that it's my fault feeling. That's really important for us to like, to stress for someone, if someone confides in you in the church of how they're dealing with whatever, anxiety, depression, bipolar, whatever, their immediate feeling is that it's my fault. Their immediate feeling is like, I did something wrong, something's wrong with me, you know what I mean? Someone sat with me a week ago when I was in town and told me this exact thing. Like they were someone who was dealing with like anxiety that they were vomiting 15, 17 times a day. Like, can you imagine? I can't imagine functioning that way, right? But there was a time when they couldn't function because of how bad their anxiety was, and they felt like why can't I trust God more? It's like it's not about that. You trust God, you know. So just alleviating the spiritual burden off people is huge, just for us to be able to do that, and for us to be able to share that with other servants, and highlighting the fact that it's an actual illness. And for some of us, we'd be like, oh, of course. Like, who would say otherwise? Had a pharmacist, Coptic super servant, speak to me last week and say, hey, I'm all for the whole mental health thing. You know, I think it's great. But, like, of course, we don't believe in antidepressants. So what do you mean? It's not like what do you mean we don't believe in antidepressants? Like, it's not like a supernatural being that we believe or don't believe. It's medicine, right? But you would be surprised. And this is a pharmacist, so their profession is pharmaceuticals, right? Someone who's Coptic, who's a servant. So we can think, like, of course everyone believes it's an illness, but they don't. So we have kind of an onus to, like, share the basics of this, even again, if it's not our particular specialty, of it's an illness. It's not a spiritual problem always. There is a spiritual element, like we said, that's important to remember. And that the church itself, and this is again, I'm speaking only from Emba David's perspective because like he's my boss, like in our diocese, but I think this also applies for Emba Serapion, Emba Yusuf, Emba Mina for North America. And even the Pope actually, he was discussing this when we met with him too. The church doesn't have a stance against antidepressants or medication for mental illness, just as a blanket statement that we should all know, but that we should share. I mean, is it always the answer? No. Is it always indicated? No. But just like any other element of medicine that we know, sometimes it's indicated, sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's hurtful and it's contraindicated, right? But that's important to kind of to have. So this one here of what do I actually do? What's my aim? Like last night, someone asked me, okay, you're going to give this talk here to these guys. What are we trying to do in this here? And it's just these three simple things that are not like, I'm not saying we should all create a Coptic mental health center in every church, right? Because for one reason, it's not needed. There's most cities that we're in have free services. We just don't know about them. So our number one priority is to see how do we build a referral network. I'll give you an example for us in Staten Island. We had a new priest. He's been a priest for 2 months, and he's already like, Mina, I got to refer mad people. Like, help me, right? So I guarantee you, whatever parish you serve in currently or you have served in the past, there has been significant amount of mental illness in your parish. It's just a question of what has been the church doing about it. This is both from within the church and also in the community. What's been the approach? Has the church been saying, let's just approach it spiritually 100%? Or has there been that kind of referral network? So that's kind of our first basis of build, and I'll go through in a second of how we can build that referral network. The second is educating or sharing the knowledge you already have that you take for granted, that you figure like it's basis. Come on, this is stuff I learned in first year, and it took me like 5 minutes. I didn't even like review it for boards that much, right? Oh, SIGI caps, this is so easy, right? And it is. It's easy. That's kind of what's cool was that mental health stuff is pretty easy. It's just a matter of a lot of people have the completely wrong idea about it. So teaching is easy but important. And the last one is encouraging someone to seek help. Like someone called me the other day who was like, again, like super servant. And I'm only giving you the examples of like super servants because you'd expect like the lost guy who's like doing cocaine to come and say, I'm having like hallucinations. Fine, yeah, that guy's lost and he's on cocaine. But the super deacon who comes and says, hey, I've got some issues, and I need help. That guy, oh, well, or the priest, or the fact, I mentioned the monks thing because I felt it was really important to be there in Wadi Natrun. It's an area in Egypt with a couple of monasteries, treating both like the blood pressure and like nephrotic syndrome and kidney failure of some of these monks, and also some of their mental health issues. And it was nothing that's unchristian about who they are. They were still great men of God, ridiculously spiritual monks who they needed help. So there's nothing that takes away from who you are as a Christian from there. So that's an important thing for us to encourage people to seek help with that. Two main resources I wanted to give you. Say you're in your city and you want to find a mental health counselor and you want to look specifically for a Christian one. You can narrow it down by, so this is an easy website, and I've looked through several and I felt this was the most useful for me. Therapists.psychologytoday.com. And there you can look both by Christian, like their designation, they self-identify that way, and you can look based on what area they focus on more. Say, for example, you want to refer someone for grief counseling. You want to refer someone for, mood disorders. You want to refer someone for addiction services. Based on whatever it is you want to refer, you can have a filter in the website to know who to refer. And you just put it in by zip code. Like I put the zip code in my house, boom, in comes out a list of 10, mental health professionals next to my house that I can send people to, right? We're still in the process, I know for me, in my area, in Staten Island, of like looking into them a little bit more to be sure that they're comfortable, having people from our community come to them. Because for a while, thank God for the past 2 years, we've been just referring to the clinic, to the St. Luke's Clinic, but it's starting to get overwhelmed, which is also, thank God, that there's been a lot of need and a lot of help there. But that's one thing. The other is this gathering, as you guys know, besides the awakening for the world about Robin Williams, the other prominent suicide that happened some time ago was Rick Warren's son. If you guys remember, Rick Warren, the prominent pastor in California. So he started this thing where he had Catholic bishops, basically leaders from multiple churches, gathering in Southern California in this forum called Mental Health in the Church. It was like a day of sharing resources, equipping the church, and having this conversation. There were psychiatrists, there were priests, there were tons of people. So the website has like a really great booklet. There's a YouTube page that has both like in-depth, the plenary talks from the day, and also has like little snippets, say like 2 to 3 minute snippets of what you should do about this or what you should do about that. So it's really like a really helpful resource to just have in your pocket kind of thing. Make sense? There are of course a ton more, but I figured these are like practical necessities of how to build a referral network. That website down there will just help you build one right now. And the first one will help you in the education bit of, because maybe especially like you want to be able to communicate things in the most ideal way. You're not sure how. I don't know if you can see it. So it's just, even if you just Google mental health and the church, this is the only thing that really comes up. It's the most important thing. So the last thing I want to share with you real quick, because we're almost out of time, is mental health and mission. So you figure like however bad mental health services can possibly, or how poor they can possibly be in America, and of course you can imagine that it's a little bit more like globally. So from GHO, it's saying that there about 80% of people suffering from mental illness live in the third world, live in like, have no access to mental health care as well. And 13% of people with disease only have 2% of expenditures. That could sound abstract. To make it more practical, think about this. This is one kind of case in one country. In Ghana, so there's 22 million people. Of 2.2 million people there who have mental illness, maybe I should have asked you beforehand, what you think would be like an outrageous number. How does 3 hospitals and 12 psychiatrists sound? And the reason why I bring this up, I thought it was kind of cool. One of the medical missions conference that we went to, they were showing a similar statistic but about dentistry. And they were saying how many millions of people per one dentist, right? And they did something really great is that they trained actually local pastors on like, obviously they didn't make them dentists, but they gave them like core basics of dentistry. And then thousands and thousands of people started coming with they were just able to whether do extractions or whatever, like just kind of putting out fires, right? And and they were kind of showing data of like how many thousands of people came to Christ as a result of that, and how many thousands of people like didn't die of horrible infection and all that kind of stuff. So imagine there, for example, in these African countries, again, not all of us being specialists in this, but if we considered the idea of the mission in mental health, of training more church people with some of the basics that we already know, some of the how to recognize, let's say, just even categories, mood disorders, psychotic disorders, hey, this is first line, boom. And one of my friends who practices in Texas says like how whenever they've went on a mission trip, let's say like they went to Nigeria, one of the cool things about mental health mission stuff is that sometimes if you're trying to do, let's say like cardiothoracic surgery, you can't give standard of care in the third world, right? Sometimes, because you're limited by equipment. Sometimes for mental health, you can give standard of care because it's just one medication that's first line, boom, and you give it and you're good. So that's kind of what I wanted to encourage you with about that. My personal experience in the CMANA trip was transformative, like really showed that like in Egypt, there's a big need. Both, we were able to also like share some things with the local team of mental health people and like alleviate some of the pain of the people that we saw directly there. So as the kind of a summary, the idea there of taking the orthodox perspective on the sanctity of life and applying it to the subjects we're gonna hear about now in a second, and this subject that's been neglected, like as you see kind of from this morning from Abuna's talk, there are a lot of subjects that are a little bit neglected that we got to talk about. So I thank God for this conversation, bioethics and stuff like that, mental health, all these things that like the church has been waiting for us to have this conversation, I feel, right? So the church is waiting for us to begin to have a stance on these things and to begin to do something about them. So it's what we do locally within our parish, what we do in our community, and what we do globally. Cool? Any questions? No? Okay. Thank you guys. So we'll have. Just want to welcome you guys that came now. We're so glad you guys came. I know it's a long distance and stuff like that. We're just going to take a little bit of break to get you time to settle in and have like a snack together, and then we'll come back and start the sessions. Is that good? Okay. So let's.